Tobacco has been cultivated and smoked by American peoples since the dawn of time. According to the original inhabitants of the Bahamas, the Lucayans, it was a strange traveler called Caracaracol, the Scaly One, who brought tobacco to the lands of mortals. They regarded it as a sacred herb. Caribbean natives would not enjoy their tobacco in a peace pipe, but rolled up into rudimentary cigars. Fast forward a few hundred years to the arrival of Europeans, and tobacco had become a cash crop to drive the forces of global economies. From Virginia to Brazil, plantationers exported entire ships full of the funk back home, where its smoke cluttered the walls and windows of households, taverns, brothels, and even barber shops. Universities praised it for its medical properties, but the clergy criticized tobacco for its unesthetic appeal and foul smell, calling it a poison concocted by the devil. But hey, smoking is badass, so no one cared. We're talking mass consumption. Men smoked, women smoked. The age of exploration brought about a psychoactive revolution, where tea, coffee, tobacco, and sugar became part and parcel of our ancestors' daily lives. It wasn't just the upper classes who enjoyed a smoke. Finnish milkmaids were described as being caught with clay pipes between their lips. It was an effective way to cheer you up in a daily life marked by death, disease, war, and backbreaking, monotonous labor. In Sweden and Finland, the most popular mode was to drink tobacco, that is, to smoke it from a pipe. It could also be chewed or snorted up the nose, in the form of snuff. And no, I'm not referring to the film genre. First introduced by sailors and soldiers in the 1620s, tobacco had become a household staple in Scandinavia by the 30s. Though the government actually recognized it as unhealthy, they also saw an opportunity for income. A heavy tax was placed on the imports of pipes and tobacco, leading to rampant smuggling. The government needed another solution. The dominant economic theory of the day was mercantilism. Basically, it strived for boosting exports and minimizing imports. A country would preferably be self-sufficient, so it was a form of proto-autarky. If a country didn't have enough resources to be self-sufficient, they had to conquer territories abroad. So the popular demand for tobacco was a driving factor in Sweden's short-lived colonial ambitions. Sweden and Finland had scarce resources and a small economy, which needed boosting in any way possible. Colonialism looked like a very tempting way of funding the constant wars waged across the Baltic. Colonization in the 17th century was chiefly driven through private initiative. Grassroots colonization was usually done by religious minorities fleeing persecution, like the English Puritans or French Huguenots. Their motivation was freedom. State-sanctioned colonization was done through national trading companies. Their interest was entirely economical: acquire resource, sell resource. The French West India Company colonized parts of the Lesser Antilles and Western Hispaniola, whereas their Dutch counterparts built the city of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. This would become the modern city of New York. In 1624, a Dutchman named Willem Usselincx approached King Gustavus Adolphus with the idea of colonizing Africa, Asia, America, and even the barely charted Australia, then called New Holland. Sweden would become a global empire on which the sun never set. Sweden had actually attempted to establish 3 different companies in the previous decades, but all of them failed, probably due to a lack of interest, and especially money. Trading companies were funded both by the government and private investors. Usselincx was more ambitious. Amongst other groups, he sought support from the clergy, citing the goal of converting heathen peoples to the Lutheran faith. Unfortunately for Usselincx, the conflict against Poland proved too distracting for the government. In 1629, the Southern Company was absorbed into the Ship Company, responsible for constructing seacraft for the Swedish Navy. The Swedish Chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, continued the colonial project on a more realistic scale. In 1636, a new company was established, Nova Svecia Kompaniet, a pretentious mix of Swedish and Latin, meaning the New Sweden Company. Instead of colonizing, the entire world, the ambition was simply to establish a colony on the Delaware River, New Sweden. Half of the owners were Swedish, the other half Dutch. The project's mastermind was Peter Minuit, a Franco-Dutch German who had previously served the Dutch company as a colonial governor in the same region. He had since gotten on bad terms with his previous employers, and it wasn't about to improve with him becoming a turncoat. 2 ships were purchased and loaded with supplies and items for trade with the natives. The goal was to establish a foothold, a small fort, and friendly relations with the natives. The 2 ships were named Kalmar Nyckel and Fågelgrip, meaning Kalmar Key and Griffin. Though we don't know their exact size, these were small vessels. Kalmar Nyckel having a displacement of around 300 tons and Fågelgrip either half or a quarter of it. They were quite uncomfortable for the Atlantic crossing, and they were even forced to make an embarrassing stop in Amsterdam. I say embarrassing because the project was supposed to be kept a secret from the Dutch and English rivals. After the necessary repairs were completed, the duo continued through the English Channel, the Bay of Biscay, the Canary Islands, before crossing the Atlantic. The 2 ships sailed up the Delaware River, and here's where the sources disagree. The popular narrative says that a salute was fired to summon the local chieftains. Gifts were exchanged, and Minuit purchased the river and surrounding territories for beads. A contract was signed, and the Swedish coat of arms erected over the new territory. 3 eyewitnesses provide a very different version. The company stayed aboard for 6 weeks, only making sorties to collect water and fuel. Minuit feared the arrival of English representatives. After 6 weeks, the expedition finally made landfall and built a fort, Christina, named after the Queen. Next they met with the chieftains and bought from them all the territory, within range of the fort's cannons. Regardless of how these events transpired, it seems unlikely that the Europeans and natives were on the same page about the conditions of the contract. The American concept of trade was entirely different from the European. Being a nomadic people, they didn't believe you could physically own the territory, and that buying territory simply meant buying the right to hunt, fish, and farm. One chieftain was later quoted as saying that you might as well try selling the ocean, the sky, and the clouds. The fort was constructed rather hastily. Minuit wanted a reliable defense against hostile Indians, and especially the neighboring Dutch. It was a simple construction, earthen walls surrounded by wooden stakes. The garrison lived in fortified blockhouses with loopholes for windows, and crude furniture made with axes. A small dock connected the island to the mainland. Though the garrison made some early attempts at growing tobacco, it would take years for the colony to become a net positive. But the investors wanted compensation for the Amsterdam disaster, and quickly. The expedition tried buying tobacco from the English, which they could later sell, but since they lacked a license, they were rejected. So the Fågelgrip sailed south, to the Caribbean. Her goal was piracy. Whether she succeeded or not, we don't know for sure. The captain was later accused of embezzling the booty, and the commander was known to have somehow acquired a black slave, Antonio. I wonder where and how he could have acquired a Spanish-named slave. They weren't exactly keen on peacefully trading with Protestants. Suspicious. Trade, colonization, and piracy were tight bedfellows in the early age of sail. When the English East India Company couldn't buy anything on their first voyage, they decided to rob a Portuguese galleon instead. The Portuguese, in turn, were known for pirating their merchandise from the Chinese. It didn't help that Spain had, since 1494, 2 years after the discovery of the Americas, referred to any non-Spaniard that set foot in the New World to be a pirate. But it wasn't the Spanish who'd prove the end of Peter Minuit. On the way home, he was arrested by the Dutch on St. Christopher. The ship which held him went under in a storm. The first expedition resulted in a net loss. As the years progressed, the Dutch lost interest and abandoned the project. The Swedish would continue alone. Next step was to recruit a new governor, a priest, and colonists for settling the area. The latter was especially hard. The 30 Years' War were still raging on, and had deprived Sweden of much of its population. Per capita, casualties were akin to what the US suffered during the Civil War, or Japan in World War II. The 1600s? Not a pleasant time to live in. The overall idea was to use social outcasts and undesirables. One of the proposed solutions was to deport gypsies to the colony, as the government wasn't sure what to do about them back home. This plan never came to fruition. Instead, the company would look to another group of people called the Svedjefinnar. This roughly translates to slash and burn Finns. Partially pagan, these Finnish settlers had moved to areas of Sweden where they slashed and burned large tracts of forest to make fertile farmlands. This strategy is effective in the short term, but destructive long term. Thus, they were deemed undesirable back home, but valuable for colonizing the heavily forested North America. Penal colonists were also recruited. It was a similar system to the one used by the British to colonize Australia. Any man convicted of execution might be given the chance of moving to New Sweden. Crimes could be anything from poaching, but the war had provided ample amounts of deserters. Many of these had wives and families, and if they didn't, well, at least they had some combat experience and disease immunity. One of the most prominent deserters turned colonists was Johan Prins. He had served as a mercenary in Italian, German, Danish, and Swedish service, before deserting his post and returning home. He was energetic, free-spirited, and charismatic. Judging by contemporary portraits, he was an absolute unit. His grave was opened up in 1940, and archaeologists described him as circa 1.7 meters tall, traces of powerful legs, an enormous belly, strong cranium, and a protruding jaw. In short, he was everything the colony needed. Meanwhile, the small garrison had been left to entirely fend for themselves. They had no way of contacting their country, no way of knowing when relief would arrive. Though the Dutch governor of New Amsterdam never presented a military threat, he did utilize psychological warfare. He tried convincing the garrison to leave their fortifications and move to New Amsterdam. Mistrust and rivalry brewed in the garrison, composed of both Swedes and Dutchmen. However, it seems that the garrison maintained productive relations with the Americans. I mean, of course, the Native Americans. Though often called Indians in period documents, Swedish documents usually refer to them as Wild Americans, or simply Americans. So I'll do the same. They included such tribes as the Delawares, Lenape, and Susquehannocks. The Swedish colonists maintained largely friendly relations with the Americans and treated them humanely, especially in comparison to the Dutch, who often engaged in all-out massacres. Meanwhile, government instructions to Governor Prins declared that the Americans be treated with humanity and modesty, so that they later may be informed of the true Christian faith. We don't know how Sweden would have treated its American allies and subjects if the colony had grown, or if they had made an empire like the English. But the humane treatment seems in line with how Swedish subjects had been treated for the past few hundred years. Finland was slowly integrated over time, partly through conflict, but also peacefully. Swedish settlers usually assimilated into Finnish communities, and a lot of Finns also migrated into Sweden. The Balts and Estonians remember these Swedish times quite fondly. Though the Sami faced discrimination in the 19th century, they had been treated well in the previous centuries, and had formed important parts of the Swedish economy and armed forces. Anyway, that's enough imperialist propaganda. For now at least. Prince arrived in 1643 and was welcomed by the settlers and Americans alike. He had cold blue eyes and weighed 170 kilos. The Americans called him the Big Belly. He immediately set to work. The settlers were allotted territory and began felling trees and building their homes, log houses, rudimentary, but comfy nonetheless. They had taken animals with them, and pigs were released into the wilds so that they may procreate and be hunted for sustenance. Though Fort Christina had been defensible, it was less suited for controlling river traffic. A new fort named Älvsborg was erected at a more strategic location, armed with 8 cannon, a mortar, and 13 soldiers. Smaller fortifications, blockhouses, were built at other locations. They were given names like Vasa, Finland, and Torne, indicating a heavy Finnish influence among the colonizers. Prince made his fortified headquarters on the island of Tinniku, named New Gothenburg. Here he built his private residence, Prinshof. It was later described as being the finest house between Virginia and Manhattan. 2 stories high, It had a brick fireplace and even glass windows. Whoa! Come on, glass windows were a scarcity in the colonies. Prinshof had a park and garden, a summer house, and an office. The building presented a splendorous view over the Delaware. In the year 1647, the colonists counted around 90 men and an unknown amount of women and children. They produced corn, tobacco, and Prince owned his own plantations. He ran a small government, including representatives from the settlers. He controlled the Delaware River through force and was even constructing a sloop to be used for privateering. However, things were far from perfect. The colonists were not used to the temperature. The summers were much warmer than back home. The colony suffered its first military defeat. Fort Älvsborg was abandoned after it became infested with mosquitoes and known as Myggeborg, Fort Mosquito. It's probably some of the funniest shit I've read in history. The colony wasn't entirely homogeneous. A few Dutch and Englishmen had settled within the colony's borders. Ever since the colony's inception, religious conflicts had been a problem between the Swedish Lutherans, Dutch Calvinists, and English Puritans. These were all Reformed religions, and the Spanish referred to them collectively as Luteranos. But when there weren't any Catholic heads around to smash, they turned on each other over the slightest of autism, such as whether the communion bread is physically the body of Christ or just spiritually. Aside from spiritual conflicts, earthly ones were brewing as well. The governor of New Amsterdam, Willem Scheft, continued his psychological warfare. The expeditions coming with supplies from Sweden were rare in between, and New Amsterdam was the only source of recent news. I refrained from calling them reliable because Scheft preferred to only deliver the bad sort, or leave out important details. Open hostilities never broke out, largely because the Dutch and Swedish shared an enemy in the English. Relations between the governor and natives was souring. Prince was frustrated over being told to both convert them and treat them with respect. A few colonists were attacked and killed. In his report back home, Prince wished for more soldiers to, quote, snap the necks of everyone around the river, unquote. He also wrote the following: "The Indians may hardly be peacefully converted. It has to be done through force, by killing the elderly, and bringing the rest under His Majesty's obedience, and then force them into God's truth." Basically, the only reason the Swedes didn't try to genocide their native neighbors was because the governor lacked the means. It was probably for the best, because these retaliations escalated quickly. The Americans were currently waging a brutal war of revenge against the Dutch, after they had wiped out an entire tribe. Governor Scheft had been quite tame with the Swedes, and maintained neutral, if not friendly, relations. In 1647, things were about to change, when he was replaced by Peter Stuyvesant. A military veteran, he was Prince equal in energy and ruthlessness. His arrival would mark the beginning of the end for the Swedish colony. Aside from angry complaints about the Indians, Prince delivered requests for more supplies and colonists. He especially wanted unmarried women for his male colonists to wed. As in all colonies, there was a surplus of men. In order to lure in more settlers, Prince made up a story of the Americans having found mountains of gold and silver. It was all bogus. Back home, the 30 Years' War had come to an end. Plunder brought in from the continent allowed the aristocracy to live in luxury. They built great palaces and hosted extravagant feasts, while the common people endured poverty and starvation. Moving across the ocean suddenly seemed very tempting. The colony had previously been a dumping ground for the dregs of society, but things seemed about to change. Unfortunately, the ship delivering supplies and settlers was captured by the Spanish on the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico. The settlers were robbed of their belongings and forbidden from holding Protestant Mass. Some of them converted to Catholicism to avoid mistreatment. One woman was converted by force and taken as a mistress by the Spanish governor. The settlers managed to escape, but were captured by the French and tortured. A Dutchman transported the few survivors back to Europe. Peter Stuyvesant was initiating hostile action against New Sweden. A Dutch ship blockaded all access to the Delaware River. Governor Prince sallied forth in a small boat, and though it was considerably weaker than the ship, the Dutchmen retreated. Not a single shot was fired. Stuyvesant was testing them, flexing his muscles. Swedish coats of arms were cut down and replaced by the Dutch. They referred to New Sweden as New Netherlands, and finally erected a fortification to wrestle control of the river, Fort Casimir. Prince's own position was failing. His term as governor was only supposed to have lasted for 3 years. They had now tripled to 9. With every report he sent back home, he asked to be relieved, complaining about his failing health. It seems unlikely that something was actually wrong with him. He later died in 1663 at the age of 69, not from old age, but during a riding accident. You wouldn't go out riding if you were in poor health. The settlers also complained of his conduct. He had failed to keep them safe, forbade them from conducting trade, whilst exploiting his office for personal profit. Prince didn't take kindly to the complaints. The alleged ringleader was put on trial and executed for treason. This didn't improve his standing. The colonists accused Prince of treating them like slaves. They were forced to work on his plantations, harvest his fields, build houses and fences, all the while neglecting their own properties and being denied compensation. His soldiers were growing mutinous. Some openly threatened to kill him. Prince knew his time was up, but before he left New Sweden, he hosted a lavish party at Prinshof, inviting the local government and American chieftains. When the meal was finished, they attended mass in the local church, before Prince and his family left for New Amsterdam, and then to Europe. The year is now 1654, and Sweden finds itself in a minor crisis. The Queen has abdicated, the Chancellor has died, and the new king is planning a war with Poland. But the Chancellor's son was determined to see the project through. 2 ships were commissioned and equipped, and 300 colonists recruited from the rural areas of Sweden. One of the new ambitions was to make New Sweden a producer of grain, beer, wine, and brandy. Strong liquor had always been closely associated with the colony's economy. Much of the trade goods brought along on the previous expeditions had been wine and brandy, which could have been given to the colonists for some party or traded to the English or Native Americans. Firewater. This further illustrates how trade and colonization was driven by psychoactive substances. Indeed, the distillation techniques that allowed for the production of hard liquor, like rum and brandy, had only appeared in the last 100 years or so, and coincided with the commercialization of the other substances, driving the psychoactive revolution. The 9th expedition to New Sweden arrived on the 21st of May, 1654, under the leadership of the new governor, Johan Rising. Fort Casimir was peacefully occupied, and the Dutch commander treated to dinner aboard the ship. The commander, his garrison, and colonists were then made to swear an oath of allegiance to the Swedish monarchy. Having been packed together for months on end in the close confinements of a ship, the new colonists had brought some new diseases with them. Some of the Americans were smitten, and their medicine men blamed it on evil spirits brought in by the ship itself. Still, they were appeased by gifts of cloth, cookware, guns, and ammunition. Rising got right to work. With the colony now having tripled in number, they planted fruit orchards, cleared new properties, and even built a sawmill. He instituted a form of social welfare, in which the poor were given money. This money was donated by the colonists and administered by the priests. When the ship departed for home, she was captured by the Dutch and brought into New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant wanted revenge for the Swedes capturing Fort Casimir. A company of 317 Dutchmen was mobilized, promised good pay and compensation for any injuries. The Swedish defense numbered only 87 men. Efforts were made to hide the invasion plans. Ships were prevented from entering and leaving New Amsterdam. American scouts alerted the Swedes that something bad was in the air. Rising set up a desperate war cabinet. They sent Swedish spies into New Amsterdam and a reconnaissance party to the mouth of the Delaware. Neither of them discovered anything. On the 29th of August, 1655, the Dutch invasion force landed on the Swedish shore. Morale was bad in the Swedish camp. Some of the defenders deserted over to the Hollanders. A Swedish officer shot one of them in the leg, and this deserter would be the only casualty of the brief invasion. Fort Casimir surrendered without a fight. The commander, Sven Skute, saw resistance as meaningless. He would later become an influential mediator between Swedish interests and their Dutch overlords. Rising made attempts at fortifying Fort Christina. He had only been able to muster 30 men, some of whom were sick, others deserted. He spent the next few days arguing with Stuyvesant in writing. An American messenger delivered the letters between them. When he realized he couldn't bargain with the Dutchman, he arrived at Stuyvesant's tent and signed the capitulation. With the stroke of a pen, Sweden's American empire was over. The conditions of the capitulation were quite humane. The settlers were allowed to keep their property if they wished to stay, and religious freedom was guaranteed. Anyone who wished to leave would be given free transport back to Sweden, and the local officials would be allowed to keep their books without being searched. Apart from the one deserter shot by his officer, the invasion was bloodless. The aftermath, however, would prove unpleasant. The Dutch soldiers, seeking payment for their effort, descended on the undefended colony, slaughtering farm animals and plundering the houses. Karma would come and bite them in the ass. With New Amsterdam undefended, a force of 900 Americans descended upon the city in a fleet of 64 canoes, exacting bloody revenge upon hundreds of Dutchmen. 9 years later, the city was conquered by the English and renamed New York.
Hey guys, I'm in New York City just hanging out.
De stad heet Nieuw Amsterdam. Het heet niet New York, het heet Nieuw Amsterdam.
Many, if not most, of the Swedish settlers chose to stay, and they cooperated closely with the Dutch and English. The Finns were great at clearing out properties, the Swedes were hard workers, and the Dutch for handling maritime affairs and commerce. Relations with the Americans were fruitful, and would set a peaceful precedent for the Quaker colony, established by Sir William Penn, the namesake of Pennsylvania. If you want to learn more about the history of early Pennsylvania, you can check out this video made by the crew of the Fancy. The Swedes on the Delaware would continue living under their own language, culture, and religion. They still worshipped under the State Church of Sweden, and priests were frequently sent from back home. By the mid-1700s they had begun to assimilate, and in 1789 they cut ties with the Church of Sweden. Swedish soldiers had fought on the American side in the Revolution, and Sweden was one of the first nations to recognize the United States, signing a trade agreement with them in 1783. Today, 1.2% of Americans are of Swedish heritage, and 0.2% of Finnish. Names like Lindstrom, Dahlgren and Malmquist are Swedish in origin, as is the action hero, Rambo. One of Sven Skute's magistrates was named Peter Rambo. I don't know if he ever ran half naked through the woods, fighting off the Dutchmen with akimbo muskets or a portable swivel gun. Most of these Swedish Americans are descended from the 1.5 million immigrants who left Sweden in the mid-1800s. That was a third of Sweden's contemporary population. It was one of the most influential events in the nation's history, and will have to be tackled in a future video. Please tell me in the comments if it's something you'd like to see.